Professor Steve Hayward, welcome back to Pepperdine School of Public Policy.
It's great to be back, Pete. I'm grateful for the invitation to return.
You've obviously had several years teaching up north at Cal Berkeley. Tell us a little bit about what attracted you to return to Malibu.
Well, the program here is really the most unique and I think in many ways the best public policy program in the country. And among the many reasons I think that is policy isn't an exact scientific discipline. It's not like physics or even economics in some ways. There's more of an art to it. It's sometimes hard to separate from politics, but I think that a well-rounded policymaker is someone who not only has a grasp of technical subjects like economics or cost-benefit analysis or the law, but is also someone who understands the political character of the country. A lot of policy schools don't even try to teach that very well, and this is a school that consciously tries to say, really what I think this school is trying to make people into statesmen. That's a term we don't use much anymore. It's fallen out of fashion because it's thought to be too subjective. But that older term captures the well-rounded, complete character of someone who wants to enter public life in a serious way.
Now, you've pointed out that what makes the program here unique is this balanced approach. We're not a master's in political philosophy or political theory. At the same time, we're not a hard technocratic master's in economics or some of the other purely quantitative or analytical disciplines. Why is it important to have both of those sides? Not just the great book side, but also not just the technocratic and quantitative side of a discipline.
It's very easy to mistake technical expertise with wisdom. Wisdom's harder to find. That's also not an exact science. But our best leaders, from presidents, but also administrators, people who run large organizations, public or private, are often people who have some prudence about them. That's why there's a whole course here on prudence, another term that is thought to be so unscientific that it can't be taught. And I think that's a category error, as we say, right? In other words, this is a program that self-consciously is trying to create that fully rounded public leader. And a lot of other schools have just given up on that. I've actually talked to people at very prominent public policy graduate programs and described the way it's done here at Pepperdine. And they say, gosh, I wish we could do that. We don't know how to do it.
You've just given a talk here to our incoming cohort of students on leadership. And one of the points you make is that this approach, this balanced approach to preparing public leaders, as you say, not just purely policymakers or bureaucrats, is especially important for this time where, as you noted in the talk, we've been seeing nationally these declining levels of trust in our public and private institutions. Say a little bit about why this approach that takes in the great books and study of American founding, why that's particularly important for preparing public leaders now.
I think especially young people, they're full of idealism and energy, and many of them will gravitate too easily to an ideology or quick fixes or gimmicks. And that can be in the left or the right. It's not an ideological point. It happens across the political spectrum. And sometimes those ideas are worthy, but they're usually incomplete. And above all, I think what you want people to understand is the world's a much more complicated place. So you don't want to dampen that idealism or that enthusiasm, but you want to temper it, like steel, you might say. And so that's why it's important to step back, think for a minute, engage with thinkers over the millennia who've wrestled with these same kind of basic problems. How do you structure institutions? What's the most secure foundation for individual rights? What makes for a good free economy? How do we safeguard these things? All those questions, and they're endless almost, right? They need to be considered in depth and not simply as something that you give a menu of hasty answers to.
One of the notes that you make and references you made in this last talk to the students was Max Weber's Politics as Vocation. And you noted that in Weber's view, the use of the word vocation was very intentional in that he was using it in the biblical sense, that politics was to be pursued out of a sense of calling, a calling made by a caller, in this sense, God. Why do you think it's important for students, even if they're not students of faith, to have a sense of calling to a higher purpose when it comes to careers in the public service?
You know, in modern times, vocation is a synonym for profession. But that's a very modern meaning. If you go back just a few hundred years, vocation was almost strictly a religious term. And among religious elders, at least, it's what's your vocation? Oh, I'm a nun, or I'm a priest, or I'm a monk, or I'm a lay minister. And those were understood to be, by the way, what's vocation is, you know, it comes from the Latin root for speaking, you know, and vocal. And it was always thought that you had a calling from God to be a priest or to take holy orders. So we've lost sight of that in modern times. Max Weber meant it in the old-fashioned sense, I think, both out of his respect for religion and religious people, but I also think he discerned in that older meaning of the word a quality of people who have a commitment to public life that goes beyond just passion or interest. They're actually, I put it this way, genuinely public-spirited. Now, Weber didn't say this, and I'm just going to freelance here and say that maybe there is in some way that's hard to really articulate, a parallel between public-spiritedness for a political person and the Holy Spirit in a ministerial person. I think that's possibly true, but as I say, hard to articulate and pin down.
The work that you do currently, you're obviously an academic, but at the same time, you're involved in a number of different media enterprises and writing and so forth. You're really involved in so many different enterprises. I think one of the interesting things about our graduate policy degree is that it's not simply, or I should say, it's not only preparing students for careers in government. We have seen students like an Eli Steele go into documentary filmmaking. We've seen other students like Cassie Dillon go into blogging and more the news side, so the media side of politics and policy. At the same time, we have students working at the city of Malibu and Capitol Hill. Talk a little bit about how this balanced approach can prepare students for a variety of different careers in public policy.
I sometimes tell beginning students, either in political science or public policy, I'll say, oh, so you want to be a political scientist or a public policy specialist. Well, in that case, you have to know everything. And that's going to take a while. Now, I don't say that to scare them, but what I mean by that is you need to be very capacious in your outlook. You don't want to narrowly specialize in just doing, for example, cost-benefit analysis. That's what we hire accountants for. Good to know about it and how it works, and that's quite important. I'll just sort of personalize it to myself. I'm a very unusual person. I began my first career as a journalist, just local news, and I've always thought it's important to know how to write and communicate with the general public. I was always interested in philosophy and political subjects, but I was also, I think, rare for that kind of person, good at math. So it's not really a joke that I'm equally at home talking about Plato or Aristotle or modern philosophy, and equally comfortable, and I've taught, in fact, energy policy, for example. And that involves a lot of math, learning the measures of energy units and all the infrastructure that goes into it. And so that makes me a bit of an odd duck. And maybe it's hard to replicate, but that's, I flatter myself to say, I like to think that's the model of what you'd want to try to produce from a well-rounded public policy program.
Speak, if you would, to the prospective student, someone that is thinking about going on for a graduate degree in some broader field of politics or policy, who understands that they need to take that next step in their education before going on for or returning back into a career in politics and policy. Why should they consider coming to Pepperdine?
When I first got out of college and was interested in being a political journalist or writer or something like that about serious things, I immediately recognized I didn't know enough, even after 4 years of a good college education. This was before the Pepperdine School of Public Policy existed, or I would have come here. And in fact, what I did on my own, and I won't go through it all, but I could have cobbled together my own version of what the Pepperdine program is, believe it or not. It was a mixture of political thought, American government, and policy analysis. It may be an odd duck at my graduate school. and it's served me very, very well. And so I think that for students who come out of college and they have good educations, but in the modern world, it's important, I think, to get advanced training. It can be in law school, it can be in economics, it can be in business, or it can be in public policy. I think that you want to look for a program that equips you to be very capacious about how you approach and engage the world. And there's so few programs that do it. And this is one of the few, maybe the only one in public policy that does it intentionally and does it very well.
So, Steve, you have had the experience of speaking at other graduate policy programs. You're familiar with them broadly. You've noted how unique the Pepperdine program is. Could you be a bit more specific as to what the other programs are teaching and what kind of graduates you think are being formed out of that experience?
One of the big problems in modern intellectual life and in higher education is the view that goes back to the Enlightenment, really, that only empirical scientific knowledge is valid knowledge. And so when you're uncertain about, well, how do we teach about the foundations of institutions and constitutions and so forth, a lot of the impulse is simply to punt on those difficult questions and just teach technical aspects and technical approaches to it. Now, a lot of the programs are very good at teaching very advanced statistical techniques and economic analysis and legal analysis. And a lot of those people do fine jobs out in the public sector. What's different about Pepperdine is two things that go together. One is, as a faith-based school, can't ignore questions of a higher order. I'll just put it that way. Second one was, as of course you know better than me, the curriculum was explicitly designed by people like James Q. Wilson, one of my heroes who I knew a bit, to be a callback to the kind of education our founders would have received, or even people in mid-century America like Franklin Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower in some ways, or the senior people around him like the Dulles brothers. And those kind of people got a different education than people get today. They wouldn't have gone to a public policy school. But if they'd gone to Pepperdine, they would have turned out very much the way they did. And we need more people like that.
Steve, one of the commitments that we make here at the policy school, and it's noted right on the homepage, is a commitment to what we call viewpoint diversity. The openness to, whether inside the classroom or the kinds of speakers that we bring, to proposing, promoting, encouraging different points of view. You've written, spoken many times on the challenges to viewpoint diversity in higher education. But I think it's particularly important if we're preparing public leaders that they're exposed to different points of view on policy issues. Talk a bit about why that would be important to this kind of education here at Pepperdine.
My favorite moments in classrooms are when students want to argue with me, or argue with the point I've made. It might not necessarily be my point, but it's one I've laid out. And sometimes if a student doesn't want to argue with me, I end up arguing with myself. Because I think it's absolutely crucial that students be exposed to a full spectrum of opinion and options and alternatives on any particular issue or subject or way of thinking about an issue. One of the problems with universities these days is they become very rigid and conformist monocultures. There are a lot of reasons for this. It's not always ideological. Sometimes it's methodological. A school or a department will simply say, we do this approach to a subject, and all the same people cluster to it. And so you don't get much viewpoint diversity. You don't get much methodological competition, and that's a big mistake. Hard to change all that. And so, I think that one of the great things about Pepperdine is you do get a full spectrum of students, not just conservative religious students. And I'm pretty sure this would be true if I were able to do a comprehensive statistical survey. You'll find the discussions are more open and wide-ranging than they are in a lot of universities, precisely because it's on everyone's mind here to do it that way.
Why does the country need Pepperdine School of Public Policy?
If you don't have leaders who get a broad-gauged advanced education, then the country will be run by narrow specialists. And as smart as they are and dedicated as they are, they will get things wrong. They're unable to make serious trade-offs. They're unable to understand the public very well. They're able to think in long-term ways that are necessary. That's what I think. And just to pick one narrow example, it's something that is studied here and actually studied well a lot of places, is path dependence and narrow thinking and mission obsession of individual agencies. You need people to run those agencies who say, yes, you want to do this, but think of the 5 other agencies or interests that are going to be affected by it. That's where you need a broad gauge person to understand and bring those issues up and push them up the ladder to governors, senators, and presidents.
One of the ways that you described the uniquely important aspects of the policy school curriculum was that a Pepperdine student is able to understand the public part of public policy. Talk a bit about how you think that happens and why is that important for policymakers, not just to get the policy right, but to understand the public part of public policy.
We call it public policy and not just policy. In other words, the program understands that policy is not made in a laboratory for lab rats. It's made for real human beings who are different, equal in important ways, but different with their interests and dispositions and character and so forth. And so a policy program that doesn't take into account that the public comprises a lot of different aspects of really what we call political life or social life is not going to be making very good policy at the end of the day. That's sort of my bias about the matter.
Steve, in the spring, you're going to be teaching one of our core courses here on the American founding, the Constitution, and the relevance of many of those constitutional arguments to today's public policy. Talk a bit about the importance of that course for policymakers and how in teaching the course, it's not so much a history course as it is an applied history course for policymakers.
I think it's very important to go back and study the founding as the founders understood it themselves. In other words, I think we need to recapture their logic, the reasons why they thought this design was the best they could come up with for the country. And one reason for that is a lot of people, a lot of young people especially, think our Constitution is obsolete or has glaring defects. And maybe that's so. But I always like to go back to the famous line of G.K. Chesterton that John F. Kennedy liked. Before you remove a fence, spend some time finding out why it was put there in the first place. Of course, we should always be proposing reforms and changes, whether it's just to administration of agencies or constitutional changes at the highest end. But we should always start, I think, with saying, why was it set up that way? Did it serve us well? And if it didn't serve us well, then what's going to improve it? I mean, there are great examples of changes we made that we later regretted. The biggest one everyone remembers is prohibition. We wrote that into our Constitution and regretted it within a decade. And so it's easy to make mistakes when you think that we need reform.
So, Steve, you just spoke with students here at New Student Orientation. We're going to see you a couple times this fall. You will be teaching a couple classes for us in the spring, including the core course. What are you most looking forward to getting back into the classroom here at Pepperdine?
Having now been around several other institutions, which I enjoyed, I'm looking forward to the students here. One of the things about this program is it does attract a true diversity of different kinds of students and different student interests. I mean, at law school, everyone wants to be a lawyer. And so, I mean, they're great kids, but they're all after the same thing. Students here have very different ambitions and outcomes. And so it just makes it more interesting and spontaneous in a certain way. Second, because the curriculum is so much fun, and also I relish the challenge, and filling Ted McAllister's very large shoes is a great challenge and honor. I just like the vibrancy of the place. There's an energy here. It's what's that great line of Daniel Webster from the Dartmouth College case? It's a small college, but there are those who love it. And I kind of think it's a small program, but there are those who love it because it's the only one like it.
Well, Steve, it's our honor to have you back, and I'm jealous of the students who'll be taking you.
We'll drop in once in a while.
We'll do it. Okay, we'll do it.